What if the very first humans, those fragile beings wandering through vast and untamed landscapes, had already begun asking themselves why they existed? Not just how to survive, but for what purpose they endured the cold, the hunger, and the darkness. Imagine standing barefoot on rough ancient soil, surrounded by a silence so deep it makes your heart beat louder. No language, no gods, no books. Just the echo of your own breath under a sky so immense, it feels like it's trying to speak to you. Could it be that 1.8 million years ago, in the raw beginnings of human awareness, they discovered something we've long forgotten? We often think of primitive humans as nothing more than instinctual creatures. But what if they were already sensing something bigger, something spiritual, something destined? Imagine a tribe pausing near a riverbank. One of them suddenly stops, staring into the mist, not because of danger, not because of a sound, but because something called them. A vibration in the air, a pattern in the bird's flight, a shape in the rocks. Were these coincidences? Or did early humans already connect signs with meaning? We know they painted, they buried, they feared. But fear is only powerful when it's connected to something worth losing, or something worth understanding. What if those fires they lit at night were more than warmth? What if they were portals of thought, silent moments where the mind reached out to something invisible? It's tempting to think these were just rituals. But what if they were primitive conversations with destiny? You might be surprised at how little separates you from them. Today, we name our anxieties. We chase fulfillment through careers, religion, relationships. They didn't have the words, but they had the questions. And sometimes, questions are louder than answers. Was the echo in the cave just an echo, or a reply? Was the dream just random, or a map? In a world without distractions, maybe they saw more clearly than we do now. You've probably felt it too, that strange sensation that something is guiding you, or warning you, or calling you. That's not modern, that's ancient, that's primal. And the people who first felt it may have known something we're still trying to remember. Have you ever experienced that eerie feeling that something beyond logic was shaping your next step? If this resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. Your story might echo one told around a fire a million years ago. And if this journey already sparked something in you, leave a like. It tells the algorithm and our growing tribe that this content matters. Also, take a moment to check if you're subscribed, so you don't miss the next clues hidden in our shared human past. And now, let's go deeper, because what they discovered next might completely reframe how you see your own purpose. The smoke from the ancient fire had barely faded when something shifted. The group, huddled in instinctive formation, suddenly froze. Not from fear, but recognition. A pattern, a rhythm, a sequence in the crackling wood or the shadows on the cave wall. Something repeated itself. Something felt familiar. That flicker of recognition, primitive yet profound, may have been the first spark of purpose in the human mind. Before gods, before myths, before written symbols, there was intuition, and it told them, there's more to life than fleeing predators and finding food. Imagine the cognitive explosion the first time one of them connected. The full moon with tides or mating cycles or a shift in weather. That realization, that the world wasn't random, meant life had structure, and structure hinted at intention. If something out there moved in cycles, then maybe their lives did too. They began to wait, to anticipate, to look for signs, not just to survive, but to align with something deeper. Even the way they hunted began to change. It was no longer just reaction. It became orchestration, planning, coordination. These weren't just tactical improvements. They were expressions of meaning, of a shared goal, of direction. And when the hunt succeeded, there was celebration, yes, but also reverence. A pause, a look at the sky, an unspoken gratitude for something they couldn't name, but knew was present. Around that time, their brains were changing too, not just growing, but reorganizing. Neural pathways that once only fired for danger now lit up in moments of silence, of awe. They began to feel drawn to certain locations. Caves, rivers, stone formations, places that felt charged. These weren't just shelters. They were beginnings of sacred ground. Something was guiding them to see beyond the immediate. You can almost picture one of them, sitting by himself while others sleep, watching the stars. Not for navigation, not for warmth, just watching, trying to decode a message that seemed to flicker in and out of reach. It wasn't science. It wasn't religion. It was awareness, a beginning of purpose. And that awareness created tension. Because once you sense that life has meaning, you start to ask dangerous questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Is there something we're supposed to do before that? These questions didn't arrive with philosophy. They began in the dust, in the bones, in the eyes of someone who saw a pattern in the clouds and couldn't unsee it. Their minds didn't need words to wonder. The awareness of destiny didn't require language, just attention. And they had attention. Their world demanded it. Every crack of a twig, every change in wind, every shift in animal movement, it all became part of a larger conversation, a dialogue between survival and something else, something sacred. And so, purpose wasn't born in temples or tablets. It was born in silence, in observation, in the quiet certainty that something greater was at play. And they didn't just sense it. They followed it. The wind howled across the plain, dry and sharp, but something in their eyes had changed. The days were no longer just sequences of tasks. The hunt, the fire, the gathering, these now carried weight beyond necessity. It was subtle at first, like the shift of a shadow at dusk, but it was there. In the way they paused before killing, in the silent exchange of glances after a storm passed, in the instinct to protect the young even when resources were scarce. Survival had gained meaning, not just instinct, but intention. You can sense the emotional threshold they crossed. A mother's sorrow at the loss of a child wasn't just grief, it became memory. A fire that once only burned for warmth now held stories. The group began to mourn, to mark places where the fallen rested. What was that if not the embryo of belief? They didn't just want to live. They wanted their lives, and deaths, to matter. And in that yearning, purpose was born. The bones scattered in ancient sites tell us more than dates. They reveal choice, objects placed near the deceased, care in how bodies were laid. These weren't accidents. They were messages. Messages whispered to something greater or to someone yet to come. A primitive declaration, we were here and we mattered. It's almost unbearable to imagine the first time a child asked why someone died, and there was no answer. Only silence, or an attempt to recreate the voice of one who was gone. That silence may have felt unbearable, and in that discomfort, humans invented continuity. The idea that the spirit, the breath, the presence, didn't just vanish. That, somewhere, somehow, it continued. Maybe in the trees, maybe in the stars, maybe in the next child born. This emotional leap was massive. The moment survival turned into story and fear into meaning, everything changed. The night no longer simply threatened, it whispered. The storm didn't just destroy, it signaled. Every event gained layers, every action, consequences beyond the physical. Even the animals around them began to be seen differently. Not just prey, but symbols. The bear became more than muscle. It was strength, warning, wisdom. The bird was not just food, it was message, direction, omen. And as these meanings layered themselves onto the world, the human mind expanded with them. Reality was no longer flat. It had depth. We see the echoes of this today. Why do we look for meaning in dreams, in coincidences, in symbols on the street? That longing didn't begin with philosophy. It was carved into us when our ancestors first cried for something they couldn't name, and in doing so, touched something they couldn't see. They didn't survive just to see another sunrise. They began to survive for someone, for something, a child, a mate, a vision, a belief. And with every breath, every sacrifice, they were writing the first chapters of a story we're still trying to finish. They gathered at the cave's entrance as dusk settled, not because they were afraid, but because they were listening. The sky was bleeding into a strange shade, the wind had shifted direction, and the animals, usually restless at this hour, were silent. These weren't just environmental details. To them, it was as if the world was trying to say something, and they had learned to listen with more than their ears. Every crack of the branches, every flicker of flame became a possible signal. The forest didn't speak in words, but its language was clear to those who paid attention with their whole body. A sudden gust would send them into motion. A pause in birdsong might make them change direction. A rockfall in the distance might mean more than erosion. It might mean danger or guidance. Over time, these primitive humans began to map patterns not just across the land, but across events. They noticed that certain natural shifts preceded births, or deaths, or strange dreams. And once that link was felt, it was never forgotten. They began to see the world as something alive, as something that watched them back. Lightning wasn't just a flash. It was a judgment. A sudden eclipse wasn't just the moon's passing. It was a warning. Rain falling without clouds could signal betrayal or revelation. The world became a mirror of their fears, their hopes, their inner storms, and they didn't interpret these signs individually. They did it together. Around fires, they shared what they had seen, and slowly a system of meaning emerged. These were not just survival tactics. These were the first attempts to decode fate. Sometimes a child would wake screaming in the night, claiming to have seen a face in the fire. The elders wouldn't dismiss it. They would mark the day, watch for patterns, and when something happened, a sudden illness, a stranger arriving, they would link it back, cause and effect blurred with belief. It wasn't about truth. It was about meaning, a way to protect themselves from the chaos of a world they didn't control. Even dreams became dangerous terrain. If someone dreamed of falling, of drowning, of fire, the group would act. They would alter the next hunt, delay a journey, stay closer together. Their subconscious became a map of the external world. The line between inside and outside blurred. They were not just reading nature. They were in conversation with it. We like to think of ourselves as evolved, rational, above such interpretations. But how often have you paused because something just felt off? How many times have you walked into a room and sensed something invisible pushing you back? That is not new. That is not modern. That is the residue of ancient perception still living inside you. So many of their choices weren't based on logic, but on alignment. They didn't ask, does this make sense? They asked, does this feel right? And more often than not, that feeling saved them. Have you ever made a decision based on a gut feeling, one that didn't make sense at the time but turned out to be right? I'd love to know. Drop a comment sharing your experience. What signal did you once follow that changed everything? Sometimes your story might be the very echo someone else needs to hear. They didn't have written language, but they had memory. Memory carried in gestures, in repeated movements, in looks exchanged over smoldering embers. What was once just survival instinct was evolving into communication, silent yet profound. A certain path avoided, a certain tree approached with caution, a certain sound recognized as danger. These weren't isolated experiences. They were passed on. And in that passing, something extraordinary began to happen. Collective purpose. At some point, one generation began to teach the next not just what to do, but why. Why the stars mattered. Why certain caves were sacred. Why it was dangerous to sleep during specific moons. These weren't mere habits. They were lessons rooted in a deeper structure of meaning. And that moment, when knowledge became intentional, when ideas were deliberately transferred, marked the birth of culture. You can picture it. A young child watching an elder trace shapes into the sand. Not random doodles, but echoes of stories told beside flames. A rhythmic tapping of stones. A repeated sound pattern. A reenactment of a hunt not for entertainment, but for understanding. These acts shaped how early humans thought, not only in reaction to the world, but in interpretation of it. And every retelling was an act of preservation, of continuity, a bridge between lived experience and imagined consequence. As these primitive stories expanded, so did their emotional resonance. A tale of a deadly storm became more than a warning. It became a narrative about respect, timing, the balance between boldness and caution. A success in the hunt wasn't just retold to celebrate, it was dissected, remembered, revered. And from these emotional anchors, values emerged: bravery, caution, patience, trust. These values, though not named, began to guide decisions. The tribe that once moved chaotically began to move with intention. Elders were respected not just for age, but for knowledge. Children were nurtured not only with food, but with memory. And slowly, each generation began to believe that they were part of something longer than their own breath. They weren't just surviving for themselves, they were stewards of understanding. And then came ritual. Repeated actions at certain times. The marking of seasons not with tools, but with fire and dance and silence. The collective gaze toward the sky on a night when the moon was absent. They were trying to say something back to the forces they felt around them. Perhaps asking for protection, perhaps offering thanks, perhaps just acknowledging that they were aware that they were small in a world that spoke in wind and rain and stars, but that they mattered anyway. These moments forged bonds stronger than blood. A shared purpose grew, not just to endure, but to remember, to teach, to honor. And with each story told around a fire, the tribe became something more than a group. It became a thread in a longer fabric, woven from memory, shaped by meaning, and stretched across time. Some nights, the wind shifted in a way that made even the most experienced members of the tribe fall silent. Not because of danger, but because of something heavier. The feeling that something was about to change. In those moments, fear wasn't just emotional, it was instructive. It didn't paralyze them, it gave them direction. Fear became a compass, pointing not only to what must be avoided, but to what must be faced. A sudden stillness in the forest, the sharp cry of an animal at an unusual hour, or even a recurring nightmare shared by more than one member of the group, these weren't dismissed. They were interpreted. Fear wasn't weakness, it was a message. And the more it was acknowledged, the more refined their responses became. A trembling hand was no longer a sign of cowardice, but a signal that something deep inside had picked up on something others hadn't noticed yet. This transformation in the function of fear marked a turning point in early human evolution. They no longer ran blindly. They calculated, they observed, they discussed. Around firelight, they exchanged details about what had gone wrong, where an ambush occurred, why a hunting path felt cursed, when the rains betrayed their timing. And over time, the emotional intensity of fear evolved into foresight. What was once panic became strategy. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The more they responded to fear with intention, the more they began to believe that it had meaning. That fear itself was not random, that it came from somewhere, that it arrived as a signal. They began to prepare, not just physically, but spiritually. Some carried carved bones, wore animal teeth, marked their skin with ash or pigment before a journey. Not for beauty, but as protection. As armor against forces they couldn't name, but could feel. This internal shift gave rise to a new kind of movement. The tribe began to relocate not just for food or shelter, but because something called them, or something pushed them away. Entire migrations were set into motion by a single event, a strange illness, an ominous sign. a repeated loss. They followed the invisible, trusting the unseen, convinced that their path wasn't just survival, but destiny. And then came the dreams, not simple flickers of memory, but overwhelming visions. Entire hunts played out before they happened, faces seen in sleep that later appeared in waking life. And when this happened more than once, they no longer called it chance. They believed these moments were instructions, maps, warnings, or even invitations. Fear, now fully evolved, was no longer avoided. It was consulted. They began to seek out those among them who were more sensitive. The quiet ones, the dreamers, the children who spoke of things they hadn't seen. These individuals became advisors, protectors of the invisible narrative that ran parallel to daily life. Their role was not to lead with strength, but with perception. They didn't hold weapons, they held memory. And so, step by step, fear transformed the group, not by making them smaller, but by forcing them to see larger patterns. What once scattered them now brought them together, and every decision taken in fear began to carry the weight of intention, of belief, of destiny. The night was not just the absence of light. It was a threshold. When the last embers dimmed and the forest exhaled its long breath, something shifted. The earliest humans didn't rush to sleep. They listened. In the darkness, where sight faltered, other senses awakened. The crackle of distant leaves, the rhythm of dripping water in a cave, the pulsing hum of nocturnal life. It all felt different, sacred, unstable, pregnant with possibility. The night wasn't empty, it was full, and that fullness became the stage for the first spiritual awakenings. Fear had evolved into direction, but now direction was evolving into seeking. They weren't just reacting to the unknown, they were reaching for it, watching the shadows, tracing stars, waiting for signs in silence. Some sat alone, eyes open, not sleeping, not moving, just waiting. They believed the night whispered things the day concealed, that spirits walked when the sun fell. That purpose became clearer when all else dissolved. The rituals began subtly. A hand pressed to the earth before lying down. A stone turned a certain way. A word, meaningless to outsiders, murmured under breath before sleep. These actions, weren't copied from others. They were felt. As if something deep inside guided them, and over time, as these acts repeated, they formed a language. Not of the mouth, but of the spirit. A silent agreement that the world beyond sight was as real as the fire in front of them. Some began to dream more vividly. Images they couldn't explain, symbols etched into memory, voices they didn't recognize but trusted. And the group noticed. Those who dreamed deeply began to be approached in the morning. What did you see? What did it mean? Their inner world became public prophecy. Their sleep became communal guidance. And so sleep itself changed. It wasn't just rest. It was access, a doorway, a nightly journey into the invisible. The cave became a vessel, the walls sacred. Some began to paint, shapes, hands, animals, not to record, but to communicate. These weren't decorations. They were offerings, messages, echoes of visions seen in sleep and retranslated for those still awake. The more they leaned into the spiritual, the more order emerged from chaos. There were nights to speak, nights to stay silent, moments when no one would light a fire, not out of fear, but respect. The belief was growing. Something watched them, something older than the stars. And it didn't demand worship, it demanded awareness. And that awareness brought comfort, even in fear, even in death. They began to feel they were not alone, that the rustle in the leaves wasn't threat, but presence, that the silence wasn't empty, it was invitation. Have you ever felt watched in the dark, but not in a frightening way, as if something ancient was aware of your existence? If you've ever had a dream, a moment, a sensation you couldn't explain but never forgot, tell me in the comments. Sometimes what we call coincidence is simply a message waiting to be recognized. Sometimes they moved without knowing why. A sharp turn in direction, a delayed departure. an unspoken decision to wait just a moment longer before crossing a ravine. These weren't calculated choices, they were instinctual, but the results were often undeniable. The storm they avoided, the predator they didn't encounter, the safe path they discovered. It was as if something within them, something ancestral and wordless, knew. And over time, those moments of unexplained clarity became sacred. The tribe began to recognize that certain individuals had stronger intuitions than others. A child who always seemed to notice danger before anyone else. A woman who sensed weather shifts with uncanny precision. A hunter who could track an animal no one had seen. These people weren't just lucky. They were seen as vessels, not magical but deeply attuned. Their instincts were not questioned. They were honored. But intuition wasn't exclusive. In fact, the more the group trusted their feelings, the more often those moments emerged. It was as if the very act of believing sharpened their perception. The barrier between sensing and knowing dissolved. Gut. Feelings became shared truths. If 3 people felt unease about a path, the entire group changed course. Not because of evidence, but because experience had taught them that the invisible often spoke first. The environment responded, or at least, that's how it felt. When they listened to their instincts, food appeared more easily, paths cleared, threats passed. And when they ignored those signals, the consequences were swift. An injury, a loss, a mistake that echoed into the next season. So, they learned, not just to react, but to pause, to notice, to wait for that subtle vibration in the chest, the tingle in the skin, the silence that felt heavier than it should. Intuition, once sporadic, became a tool, not wielded with logic, but with openness. They created space for it. Moments before a decision when no one spoke. Time set aside not to plan, but to feel. They didn't call it strategy. They didn't have to. It was survival refined by spirit. And in those moments, they began to glimpse something profound. That perhaps the mind didn't hold all the knowledge. That perhaps the body remembered things the brain couldn't explain. That maybe, just maybe, the guidance came not from within or without, but from both, meeting in the space between. It was in those spaces that some of the most miraculous escapes occurred. When a mother turned back just before danger. When a hunting party halted at the edge of a trap they hadn't seen. When a voice, silent yet undeniable, said, "Stop!" And they listened. These stories weren't just told. They were passed on with reverence, because they reminded everyone that survival wasn't always about strength or numbers. Sometimes it was about the quietest signal, the voice no one else heard, the pause that made no sense until it saved them. Even after the fire dimmed and the stories faded into silence, something remained. It wasn't just memory, it was presence. An invisible residue that clung to the rocks, lingered in the air, and lived in the gestures of the living. The early humans didn't articulate this legacy, but they felt it. Each footstep they took was layered over those who had come before, and in the weight of that layering, something powerful emerged: continuity. They were not the beginning, and they would not be the end. They began to revisit certain places, not because they were useful, but because they were meaningful. A bend in the river where a child had been born. A tree struck by lightning the same day a hunter vanished. A cave where the echoes sounded deeper. These weren't just coordinates, they were sacred echoes. And in returning, in standing where others had stood, they felt the thread that connected them to something older than time. Over generations, certain behaviors crystallized. They walked a particular way around certain stones. They greeted the morning sun with stillness. They avoided places where the air felt heavy. These actions weren't taught, they were remembered. Passed not through instruction, but through presence. A child imitating a gesture they'd never seen explained. A group falling silent at a moment they didn't plan. The body knew. The lineage lived in the body. And with each generation, this invisible knowledge became clearer. The idea that they were not alone in their decisions. that they carried within them fragments of those who had come before. Instincts that weren't just personal, they were ancestral. Reactions shaped by thousands of moments lived by others. They didn't call it genetics. They didn't need to. They felt it when a new parent held their infant and suddenly knew what to do. When a young hunter froze at the sound of a rustle, heart pounding before the mind could process. These weren't accidents. They were inheritances. Their sense of destiny wasn't abstract. It was embodied. They believed they were continuing a task started long ago, that their actions rippled forward, that their failures, if left uncorrected, would echo into generations yet to come. So they took care. They observed not just for themselves, but for those who would follow. And in doing so, they became something more than survivors. They became ancestors in motion. Even the way they looked at the sky changed. The stars weren't just lights. They were reminders, witnesses, records of moments lived and promises kept. They weren't mapping the heavens for curiosity. They were tracing the same paths their elders had watched, believing that if they aligned themselves correctly, they could stay in harmony with the great unseen pattern. And perhaps they did. Perhaps that alignment between inner instinct and outer rhythm was the origin of what we now call wisdom, a quiet, unshakable knowing that doesn't shout but waits, that doesn't demand but guides. It still whispers to us. In those moments when we know what to do without knowing why. In those pauses that feel like memory, even when we've never lived them before. They didn't know the word destiny, but they lived as if it were real. With each sunrise, they carried not just the weight of survival, but the belief, quiet, invisible, unshakable, that their existence mattered, that their choices echoed beyond their footprints, that someone, somewhere, had given them a role to fulfill. It wasn't grand or glorious. It was humble. Feed the child. Respect the fire. Listen to the wind. But in that simplicity, they felt something eternal. As they aged, many didn't speak more. They spoke less, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had seen enough to understand that some things weren't meant to be spoken, only sensed. The way an elder looked at a newborn wasn't casual. It was reverent, as if handing over a torch no one could see. A silent vow passed from skin to skin. Continue. They believed they were part of a lineage, not of blood alone, but of spirit, that what lived in them came from something older than the earth beneath their feet, that their breath was borrowed, that their role was to carry forward not just flesh, but memory. And so they walked carefully. They burned their dead with rituals. They sat in silence before migrations. They placed objects beside bones not for decoration, but for guidance, for whoever came next. They didn't know who would follow, but they believed someone would. And that belief was enough to live better, to try harder, to fear less. Because in their minds, destiny wasn't just a path. They were the path. They were the road others would one day walk. And even in death, they could still point the way. That's the legacy we carry, in our hesitations, in our strange dreams, in our search for something more. We inherit not just DNA, but longing, a pull toward meaning that refuses to go silent. We call it ambition, spirituality, calling, but deep down, it's the same signal, the same thread pulled through firelight and shadow, and wind and loss. And now it's yours. If you've come this far, it means something inside you resonates with that ancient rhythm, that search, that whisper that says, you are not random, you are continuation. So leave a comment below, not just any comment, but write, this message was for me. Let others know they're not alone in feeling this pull. Your presence here already means you're walking the same path. And if this journey through time moved you, if it sparked something forgotten inside you, go ahead and like this video. It tells the system that this kind of story matters. And if you want to keep unraveling the echoes of our human story, make sure you're subscribed. There's so much more waiting just beneath the surface. There's another video waiting for you right here. It connects deeply with everything you just felt. Click it. I'll meet you on the other side.